This is Mae Brussell at KZU, Pacific Grove, California. It's broadcast number 554, and it's July the 19th, 1982. Before we begin the program, I have the usual disclaimer. I'm not used to that. I think KGO is the only station I mentioned before where I sign KBC, you sign when you come in. I'm responsible for everything I say, not this station or any other person. I'm totally responsible for any material that I put on the air, and I'll stand by it so that the station is not in jeopardy for the things that are heard on this particular program that I'm on. I don't know about the others. One little question I'm very interested in. I don't think it was a coincidence, and I think there's a lot more to it. We will hear more, or maybe we won't. Who was in the Queen's bedroom and what was she doing? Not from the standpoint of being a voyeur, but who was in there for 10 minutes? Why was he at the castle? At the residence of the Queen 12 different times? Why were all charges dropped? We don't have the answer, but I think the most strange part about it was that the Queen went to the hospital the next day to have a wisdom tooth removed. She had 4 children and didn't have to go to the hospital, but they took her to the hospital the next day. I bring that up because in the paper, The New Solidarity, June 28, 1982, there's a story about Roberto Calvi, the banker for the Italian bank that I've been talking about on the air for a few years, the one that was murdered in London, June the 18th. And this article links Calvi to the royal family in London and his fear that he would be killed in the city of London. Calvi had important contacts with the what he called the grandmother, the Masonic Lodge in London. And this article said members of the grandmother include the most important bankers in the city of London's financial district and top aristocrats. The grandmother is probably the most important single lodge of the Scottish Rite Freemasons headed by the British royal family, and is believed to be the center of the central bankers network encompassing the Bank of England, the U.S. Federal Reserve, and so forth. Roberto Calvi disappeared from Italy exactly 1 week before his body was found. I'm reading from the article from New Solidarity. When he left Rome, he went to Venice, which is an important city, very many important people that belong to that lodge, and the International Permindex Odessa Network, the Nazi network of the assassination teams that have been putting in military dictatorships since the end of World War II, before World War II, but escalating it since World War II, after Hitler and Mussolini were pushed off the stage for a while. Mussolini forever. This article says that Calvi went to Venice. He was accompanied by a person linked to the international drug trafficking. From Venice, he went to Vienna and then to Switzerland. There was a week where he was missing, and this was the same week that our President Ronald Reagan was over in London, you remember, and there was a lot of activity. He was returning from London. He had stayed at the castle. Roberto Calvi then went with a bag full of explosive documents to the grandmother before his arrival in London. And after his death, that bag of information that he picked up in Switzerland was missing. During this period, banker Calvi said, I am a member of the Grandmother Lodge of London because the P2 Grandmother Lodge, Lucio Gelli, who was again at Reagan's inauguration, who's down in Argentina, Lucio Gelli and Umberto Ortoliani persuaded me to join. If I had disobeyed those orders, I could not have done business with the city of London. And then he went on to say, I received death threats. I don't want to end up dead. He had money in his pocket, $18,000, and was on the way to Brazil. Calvi became the most important victim of the Falklands War, this article said, and they said he was involved in financing the Argentine junta to the tune of 2 billion lire through the Banco Andino, A-N-D-I-N-O. So we'll do more on this story of the Queen and the visitor, because there are so many things happening around the world now that are important, that are linked to specifically to the past assassinations that I've studied, that I'm watching different pieces of the puzzle, and some of you won't get the connections because I've been doing this for many years, and some of you will follow. It'll be quite easy. And of course, I'm going right to the murder of the former chairman of Lockheed, but there are just 2 subjects I want to mention first. One is a letter I received from Congressman Leon Panetta. I mentioned on the program before that he was going to investigate through the Congressional Research Department, the Congressional Service for the Library of Congress, information about specific years of a man who works in the Pentagon or worked there until 1978 and was the plans officer and chief advisor to the top people in the Pentagon, Fritz Kramer, that I've talked about for so long. And Congressman Panetta asked, as a member of Congress, for a search on this particular person who's advising the Pentagon, where he was from 1945 until 1947. And what he got back was a copy of the Washington Post article that I've shared with you on the air that came out in 1975, and also a copy of a New York Times article from 1979 about Fritz Kramer. Now, this is important because I understand that Henry Kissinger is going to be back jumping around the globe again as he was before. His job will be escalating, and Fritz Kramer, of course, was the man behind Henry Kissinger. The New York Times article was February 19th, 1979, how Fritz Kramer, the enemy of publicity, shaped Henry Kissinger's thoughts and actions. Translated, it means Fritz Kramer won't let you see his face and won't be interviewed and won't come to any ceremonies of Henry Kissinger or parties or celebrations. Why is he hiding? And the other article was the Iron Mentor. That was the Washington Post article of the Pentagon. The Iron Mentor, who came over with his monocle from Mussolini's Italy and Hitler's Germany, and he is the advisor to Henry Kissinger and Alexander Haig, and still has a lot of influence. His protege is still jumping the globe and will affect more wars and more bloodshed. So the congressman from our area, Leon Panetta, really got a non-answer. They sent him a copy of an article that I gave to him in the first place when I asked him to look into the matter. The second thing I wanted to mention on the air, I did bring this up yesterday. We had a meeting here of various people in Pacific Grove, but the other listeners didn't get this. There's an article about George Seldes in the Washington Post, a very nice article. You saw him briefly, but probably didn't recognize him in the movie Reds. And this is from May 19th, 1982, George Seldes. A story of, it says, George Seldes, in fact, the muckraker's lifetime as a firebrand. And it tells about his newsletter from 1940 until 1950. It was called In Fact, and he's written many, many books. And Seldes wrote to me, I had sent some things to him last week, and he's 91 years old, and he answered within a day, and he wrote to me and said what a coincidence that he was going through his files to look for my address because he had some messages to send to me. And one sentence in the letter that I think was important, he said, among the documents the U.S. Army captured at the end of World War II was a list of Hitler's friends and all the countries in the world of pro-Nazis that are in actual organizations. One report gave the number as 12 million people at the end of World War II. But he thought that maybe exaggerate, that the list was 6 million people. He says that's still a large number, and it is said to have included tens of thousands of Americans. He said that he understood that the Army officers finally destroyed the list, and there was an organization called World Service in which the Hitler regime published who their friends were all over the world, who they should do business with, what organizations were fronts for Nazi Germany or the continuation of Nazi Germany, and that the U.S. Army had this list. And instead of alerting us to this list, and he mentions the House Un-American Activity where they went for communists, they never went for Nazis, and they never looked for them. The reason I bring this up so much on this program is that I sincerely believe that our inflation and unemployment and the pollution and the things that we're doing to each other and having done to us come from this kind of fascism. I'm not supporting communism, but I think the fascism of Hitler and Mussolini was horrendous, and I think for them to bring it over to this country when we're supposed to be fighting to protect something better than what they had, we incorporated them and destroyed the records of who they were so that they could continue their operations. Now, there was a non-news story. I called it non-news because it's hardly, I haven't, except for one TV program, hardly in the newspapers I've gotten in the last few days, but a very, very important story. Ex-Lockheed chief, wife, and maid slain. The retired board chairman of Lockheed Aircraft was shot to death last week, along with his wife and along with the housekeeper. They lived in the mainline mansion section of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. His name is Cortlandt Gross. His brother founded Lockheed Aircraft in 1932. Those were the years where Charles Lindbergh was working with Goering and had moved over to England and wanted to move into Germany in the late 30s. Lindbergh moved over there in the late 30s, but around 1932 he was working as well as Howard Hughes was with what started as Lockheed Aircraft, with American Aircraft. And Robert Gross, his brother, had founded Lockheed, and this Cortlandt Gross had been the director of Lockheed for quite a few years. He was their chairman from 1961 to 1967. Now that time period, 61, is the time period where Richard Nixon lost the election to John Kennedy, and John Kennedy had become the president, and Lockheed, persons from Lockheed were very much involved in the assassination of John Kennedy, and also the Lockheed figures are very instrumental in running the career of Richard Nixon through the House of Representatives, through the Senate as vice president, and wanted him to be the president in 1960. Mr. Cortlandt and his wife's name is Alexandra, Alexandra von Rensselaer Wanamaker Gross. She had originally married one of the Wanamakers. They were murdered along with their housekeeper, Catherine Vander Veer, and they lived directly behind the home located of Dr. Richard A. Davis, the brother of the First Lady Nancy Reagan, who has a home, Dr. Davis has his home right behind the former director of Lockheed and the brother of the man who founded Lockheed Aircraft. And these two people and their maid were murdered this last week. Now, if you want a sample of Lockheed and the interlocking agency and the way it touches various conspiracies, I could give you about 100 hours on Lockheed. But I'll just give you a couple of quick paragraphs as a summary that Jim Hogan did in the book Spooks. There's a chapter called Caviar's Locus, and he describes the Lockheed Corporation and how a Mr. Daniel Houghton went to Washington to testify about problems that Lockheed was having in breaking laws in the United States. And they referred to Lockheed Corporation's chairman as he testified on some of the problems of the subcommittee on multinational corporations. And this book describes how they masterminded and raped the treasures of a dozen nations, how Lockheed corrupted the political processes of both hemispheres, how they jeopardized national security, how they screwed the taxpayer, how they destabilized the governments of three allies, undermined NATO, and undermining NATO goes along with Licio Gelli and the Alexander Haig connections and the Nazi connections from Italy and Germany, how they subverted the marketplace, how they boosted inflation, how they stimulated suicides as far apart as Tokyo and LA. And Jim Hogan in this chapter says that to study for the subcommittee to study Lockheed would be to study a pattern of bribery and intrigue that would go on continuously. They said it was a who's who of an offstage cast of geographically immune characters that seemed to have slunk from the pages of pulp fiction. In the case of Lockheed Corporation alone, the missing principals included a Dutch prince, a French pilot, a defrocked Spanish priest on the Hong Kong Tokyo currency drug market run, various heroes of the European resistance, the architect of Pearl Harbor, a survivor of Nazi medical experiments, former Manchurian spies, pro-fascist samurai with bags of industrial diamonds, and ties to the Ginza mob and the Reverend Mooney, the Moonies. The Lockheed Corporation brought over Reverend Moon in through Atlanta, Georgia, and with many tentacles to the Defense Department. And it says not to mention an assortment of Ivy League bagmen, Swiss gnomes, Arab sheiks, third world generals linked invisibly one to another, numbered accounts, conduits, and dummy core. Now that's just one little explanation of Lockheed. So sometimes if you think on the program we jump around, the Lockheed is a very complicated corporation that touches the tentacles of many areas that I've been talking about on the air for the past 11 years. In this same chapter, it describes a man described as a Catholic priest who was a bagman in Hong Kong for the exchange, and he dealt with another person, a former OSS operative who was linked to the CIA, and the way monies traveled from Hong Kong to Japan. And the Lockheed was only one of the Lockheed's Chinese Laundry. The priest worked for the Lockheed's Chinese Laundry, while Deke and company served as middlemen in transfers amounting from $8,300,000 between 1969 and 75 to $4,300,000 later. This whole book Spooks is a good analysis of all the major corporations that are involved in the assassinations, in the gambling syndicate, the disguising of priests, the popes, the churches like Reverend Moon, and so forth. This chapter also on the Calvi's locust goes into President Nixon and Henry Kissinger again, and Prime Minister Tanaka. That's Richard Allen's friend, and a lot of money transferred back and forth. So when a man of the stature of the chairman of Lockheed gets murdered, and also with the silence that accompanied it, it's very strange. Now, the same week, the same day that this family was murdered, he and his wife, Reverend Moon got an 18-month prison term. July 17th, 1982, the Reverend Sun Myung Moon sat impassively while he was told he would have to go to jail because of certain tax problems and the swindling and the disruption of the money flow that involved a lot of money. They limited to concealing $150,000 income from a $1.6 million bank account. But there was a lot of question into Reverend Moon's money. The case centered on this one particular thing. So the very day that Reverend Moon is told that he has to go to jail because the judge wants to show that the rich go off, the former chairman of Lockheed, who was involved with those years of Reverend Moon, was murdered. In the book Spooks, it tells about the use of Sun Myung Moon, Reverend Sun Myung Moon, and Mr. Kodamo, and Lockheed Aircraft, and Moon was the recipient of untold Lockheed millions. Kodamo was with the aircraft firm in Japan and Korea. And this book tells about the specter of Lockheed Corporation subsidizing the Moonies. It went from Sewell to Savannah, Georgia by means of bribes, laundered through Hong Kong by a man disguised as a Spanish missionary. And he had a so-called Beacons box, the delivery truck. In California, there's the Beacons. I don't know if they're national, but certainly in California. And the priest, his name was Jose Guardiano, but they used a Beacons box and transported millions of dollars to set up Reverend Moon. Remember how Lockheed wanted Richard Nixon to be president, and when he was in the hot water at the time of Watergate for all the various crimes that were becoming unglued, in came Reverend Moon with his big rallies to support Richard Nixon, funded by Lockheed, who gave Moon the money to get in. Now, the same week that the chairman of Lockheed and the brother of the man who founded it was murdered, there was a speaker on the Monterey Peninsula here, and he was talking about the U-2 planes. His name is Ben Rich, Vice President for Advanced Development Projects at Lockheed, California. And our Monterey Herald had an article, Lockheed speaker here, talking about the U-2 plane for the Soviet Union, the flight of the U-2 over the Soviet Union when Lee Harvey Oswald was stationed there, and how the Russians couldn't possibly have seen the U-2. It was too high up, and President Eisenhower had what he called the open sky proposal that was later rejected by the Russians. But this is an article about the Lockheed making the U-2, and I've mentioned many times the links of Oswald and his role at the Minsk radio factory, and the way the U-2 was down to break up any possible peace agreement or talks between President Eisenhower and Khrushchev. Well, the same day, it was June the 15th, a man was here on the Monterey Peninsula talking about the U-2s and Lockheed. And July the 5th, this was broadcast 552, this was 3 weeks ago, I was quoting the Jack Anderson article that was in our Monterey Herald called Renegades Ace Hole. And Jack Anderson was saying that the reason Edwin Wilson would get off with a slap on the wrist, there were many reasons, not only that he worked for the CIA, but in spite of the fact that he was arming Gaddafi and Idi Amin and the terrorists and sending equipment illegally overseas, and also it went to other countries besides those two. The Jack Anderson article said that one reason he would get off was because of Gary Powers and the U-2 flight, that Edwin Wilson was involved in the U-2 flight. Well, the point I'm trying to make again is here is the death of a man very active in the Lockheed Corporation, chairman, through all those years that I'm talking about. The week that he dies, Edwin Wilson comes home. Edwin Wilson worked for the Lockheed U-2 CIA combined. There are people discussing the U-2, lecturing about the Lockheed up here at Monterey Peninsula, And this chairman of Lockheed, whose brother founded it, is murdered in Philadelphia and lives behind Nancy Reagan. I'm going to get to that in a little while. Now, the Wall Street Journal had an article about Lockheed this week. Lockheed is more than those few sentences I read from Jim Hogan's book. If you wanted to take two organizations that would describe what I have researched and called the Nazification of America, taking over the day World War II was over 2 years before 1943, up to the present day and into tomorrow's future. If you read the paper this morning, what Weinberger was saying, and I don't want to digress on that tonight, although it upset me terribly this morning. If you take what they're doing, if you take the Howard Hughes organization and Lockheed, it was the Nazification of America. This was the real heart of the tentacles of getting control of the country. And the way you get control is to kill the people that are in your way so that your particular puppets do exactly what you want. So that when Richard Nixon, who was their trained agent since World War II, didn't win, they killed John Kennedy. And I'll go into the links of Lockheed to John Kennedy, then Lockheed to Robert Kennedy, and maybe in this hour you'll get the point. Right now, I just want to say Wall Street Journal had the Saudi agent wins arbitration from Lockheed. That's Mr. Adnan Khashoggi, the famous Saudi Arabian person who just won a permission for undisclosed payments. He's a multi-millionaire, but he's going to get undisclosed payments from Lockheed. Previously, the Wall Street Journal said they were held up because they weren't sure of the legality of the permissibility of getting payments under United States and Saudi Arabian laws. But believe me, the courts won with Khashoggi, and this is in Burbank, and he's to be paid the money from Lockheed. Another article about Khashoggi, when he was in court, his wife was divorcing him, and that process is still going on. I guess I didn't hear the settlement of it. This was a December 1981 article. The attorney for Mr. Khashoggi from Lockheed and Saudi Arabia is Joseph Ball from the Warren Commission. He also was the attorney for John Ehrlichman at the time of the Watergate break-ins, and he's also the attorney in the office of the father, Jerry Brown, in Beverly Hills, California. Now, a business partner of Mr. Khashoggi, who works for Lockheed and Saudi Arabia, was William Holden. The plot gets a little thicker. William Holden was very busy with Khashoggi. He originally owned the Mount Kenya Safari Club in Africa, and many of these safari clubs were set up as spy organizations by the Broider Band in South Africa. This was in Kenya. He was a friend of Khashoggi's. He did business with them. William Holden kept his banking in Switzerland. He was an international traveler that went down to New Guinea and Hong Kong and Japan, and when he wasn't making movies, he said that was his second job, sort of like the Pope and the President. Acting was his second job. He was an international traveler, an international banker, who sold his Kenya establishment to Khashoggi and had the Mount Kenya Safari Club. And William Holden had an early demise this winter when a lot of the pieces of the puzzle were getting unglued. Again, just in the book Spooks, it's a marvelous reference book on Lockheed. It describes for years Lockheed's secret agent in the Middle East was Mr. Khashoggi, a sophisticated man whose time is divided between royal palaces and Paradise Island and so forth. He travels all over. He was the former president's personal envoy to King Faisal during the 1973 oil embargo. And it describes his activities. His corporate fronts are in Beirut, Lebanon, Liechtenstein, Geneva, and many more places. And he's paid more than $100 million by the Lockheed Corporation alone. He has other clients in the Sudan, in Paris. He's the ultimate spook. That's Mr. Khashoggi, the business partner of William Holden before he died. Now, this last November, William Holden bled to death, according to the coroner's report. The place was meticulous. There was still empty liquor around. I still want to do 1 hour on the William Holden, Natalie Wood. I keep promising I will get to it. But Holden died in November 1981. He was about to marry somebody and take a trip to the Sudan and to Rome, where his daughter lives, and take that new Trans-Siberia Railway, that car. But he was a business partner of, Holden was a partner of Khashoggi. Khashoggi makes hundreds of millions from Lockheed, and William Holden was the best man at Nancy Reagan's wedding. Nancy Davis's wedding. And don't forget, Nancy's brother lives behind the house back to the head of Lockheed, who was just murdered. So we have the Khashoggi working for Lockheed. We have William Holden, best man at the wedding. We have the links of Khashoggi to Saudi Arabia, international organizations all over the world. William Holden, the same thing with his Swiss bank accounts and his links, close links to Nancy and Ronald, and the Lockheed connections to Khashoggi, and the Lockheed family, the Gross family, living back to back behind Nancy. Now, is that important by itself? It isn't important by itself, except in the context that it's coming down at the present time. There are so many interrelated facts about the Lockheed Corporation, as I say, into the John Kennedy assassination. George DeMohrenschildt, Lee Harvey Oswald's closest friend, his daughter married the vice president of Lockheed, and he testified about that. George DeMohrenschildt's wife came into this country through the help of the Howard Hughes organization and the Raymond Wooldridge and North American Aircraft, and also through Howard Hughes when he worked with Lockheed. In Volume 9 of the Warren Commission hearings, page 290, Mrs. DeMohrenschildt described how her brother came to this country through North American Aircraft, through Raymond Wooldridge, before that with Howard Hughes, and then he worked at the University of Chicago. That's where George Shultz came from, and we don't know what capacity. It's a huge university, but Mrs. DeMohrenschildt worked with the intelligence community, as did her husband, and they worked for that aircraft. Also, George DeMohrenschildt testified on page 206, his daughter was married to Ragnar Curtin. Ragnar Curtin's father is vice president of Lockheed Aircraft. He's a well-established fellow, went to the London School of Economics, and so forth. We're talking about Lee Harvey Oswald's closest friend, the couple that provide them with their transportation, their jobs, and their housing. And also in the House Select Committee on Assassinations, there, page 59 of I think it's volume 7, I didn't make a note of it here, George DeMohrenschildt was being discussed. He's the fellow that was supposed to have shot himself in the mouth and committed suicide when the House Select Committee was to interview him that same day. But they got enough information about him, about his links to a person like Pedro Diaz-Lance, a former test pilot for Lockheed and Pan Am, and the links of DeMohrenschildt to the military and the Lockheed. So there were many, many Lockheed connections to the Kennedy assassination. That's just one of them. So very timely when a lot of the pieces of the Permindex funding for the murder are coming out because of the Roberto Calvi murder and the missing money in Europe, and because of Licio Gelli in Argentina. The Permindex organization is being exposed, and a very important person and his wife were murdered this last week, with not as very much in the newspapers, hardly a little bit to follow it up. And then, of course, in the Robert Kennedy assassination, many of you know the name Thane, Cesar, and some of you don't. In the book on the assassination of Robert Kennedy by William Turner and John Christian, they go into the second gun controversy, and I've done a lot of that with you on broadcast. And for those of you that don't have that information, I can do more at a later time. But the security guard that shot Robert Kennedy from the back of the head was Thane Cesar, employed at Lockheed Aircraft in Burbank. At nighttime, he was sent out by the Ace Guard Service. The autopsy at Robert Kennedy's, when they did the autopsy, was a bullet wound at the back of the head, powder burns at the back, where Thane Cesar was standing. We'll take a break now because it's the end of the half hour, and we'll do some more about Lockheed, Nancy Reagan, Alfred Bloomingdale, and some interlocking relationships in that Philadelphia area. This is Mae Brussell at KAZU-FM. We're asking you to please support the station. It is the station depends upon your contributions. If you like World Watchers and Mae Brussell, or if you don't, send money to KAZU-FM, okay? Okay, this is Mae. KAZU, that's what it is. I kind of slurred that letter, but you know what it is, right? So what I'm trying to say is that there are pieces of the various assassinations funding outfit coming to light, or should come to light. They actually won't. We know that these investigations cover more than they open up. but the people who cover them have to take a peek at them. And then again, it's their responsibility to lock up or destroy the evidence that is coming out in the news or by other private investigators pushing them to investigate more. It's like the John Belushi case, where a little newspaper like the Enquirer can force an investigation of the LAPD that they may still try to cover, but at least the small independent newspaper is trying to do something, and that's better than sitting back and doing absolutely nothing on the subject. Now, I promised last week, sometimes I break promises and put them off, but it's apropos of this entire thing with Nancy Davis's brother living behind the Gross family, to talk about Nancy's walker. An interesting article, Nancy Reagan and the Flamboyant Prince of New York Society. And, you have to wonder, you don't have to wonder very much about the Reagans if you lived in California and had 1 ounce of perception. You could get a view of what they were going to be like. A lot of people in the East and throughout the country simply had no vision of him. And there's a lot of people in California who voted for him or didn't study or were not aware of day-to-day Reagan the 8 years he was governor. I happened to be aware of him on a day-to-day basis because I was doing research into the political assassinations, and you couldn't help but notice Ronald Reagan and the role that he played with people, and refusal to extradite Mr. Bradley back to New Orleans to Jim Garrison just for a hearing or some questions covering up the people in California that were linked to the Kennedy murder. But the Reagans are an interesting couple. This article in the Washington Post on the Flamboyant Prince of New York Society is written by Jennifer Allen, November the 30th, 1980. Baby Zip is his name. He's a 300-pound baby. Baby Zip, Jerry Zipkin, 66-year-old multimillionaire. I'm just reading a few sentences from the article that I outlined for you. A view of the man, if you saw him last week in the San Francisco Chronicle, he had his back to the full picture, and there's little Nancy with her arm around him dancing. Baby Zip is 66 years old. He's a multimillionaire, a real estate heir. He's the perennial bachelor. He's just the cutesy around Washington and the various parties in New York City. He's her advisor on how not to be tacky, Baby Zip, if her skirt's too long or what to wear, and so forth. This article says a discrepancy between Nancy and Baby Zip. He has a fondness for colorful people, but it's sort of out of keeping with her image, this starch, suburban, a very uptight kind of woman. They have luncheons at the bistro in Beverly Hills. She listens to him. They gossip, and they go out together. And Zipkin has been walking Nancy around for 15 years. Now, I mentioned last week, and I'm going into some more Alfred Bloomingdale. Betsy and Alfred Bloomingdale are Nancy Reagan's best friends, and Alfred Bloomingdale for the last 12 years has had little Vicki Morgan getting $18,000 a month. Her money dried up 3 weeks ago, the same date that Calvi was swinging off that bridge in London, and the same time just about the time that this former director of Lockheed is murdered, and we'll go into some more of that. But this article describes 15-year relationship, which would be about 1965. And was Zippy there when William Holden was the best man? Or he's in the sidelines, this fellow, when William Holden was the best man for Nancy and Ronnie, William Holden, the future businessman, and Mr. Kasugi. Well, the article says he gravitated towards the Reagans. I have to interpose some of this article. It's sort of like Charlie Manson gravitating from the prison up to Sacramento where he picks up a van. He gravitated towards the Reagan and their California coterie. Well, I said in those years that Reagan was being groomed for the President of the United States. So it's no coincidence this international Monte Carlo former, I guess I'll take the responsibility on the air and say the lover of Somerset Maugham. It's not so unusual to be on the East Coast international circles, but the Reagans weren't that much in 1965 or 66. Believe me, they were always tacky, from the word go, so there wasn't much to the Reagans. Well, he gravitates to the Reagans and to their friends, the Bloomingdales, the same Bloomingdales who, he's been with the Reagans 15 years, and Bloomingdale's had Vicki for 12 years. He's gravitated out there to Justin and Jane Dart and the Jack Rathers and Earl and Mary Jorgensen and the gang. He gravitates, okay? And he takes her to the hairdresser, and he takes her shopping for clothes in New York, and he chooses the museums. This is the article in the ballets and the theater and the charity luncheons. I don't even see Nancy Reagan even doing those things. I don't bet she doesn't know one artist from the other. She may know one ballet dancer, but that's it. And he has in charge of her detail of her clothes, and Zipkin is more closely allied with Mrs. Reagan than her husband. Now, I wonder where the moral majority falls into this one. Not that it really matters who Zipkin really likes or who his paramours are with, but what in the heck is he doing around with Nancy Reagan for 15 years and Lee Radziwill, and you get into a whole can of worms. The associates that he had, as I say, Somerset Maugham, had interesting background, also working for intelligence and for a spy system that links to Ian Fleming and down the Bahamas and so forth. According to this article, various descriptions he's described as a social mouth, not a moth, a court jester, bitchy, pretentious, affected, and their closest friends include Pat Buckley. Now, Nancy went to Smith College with Pat Buckley. I mean, you never hear her speak or say anything. I mean, it's certainly no accolade for Smith College that she even knows anything. But there's a list of their friends: Diane von Furstenberg, Diane Vreeland, Mary Lazar, and Jerry Zipkin. There's a photograph of him with Lee Radziwill. That's Jackie Onassis' sister, of course. And we won't go into the Radziwill family right now. Friends are devoted to him. Everybody clears with Zippy when they come to town. You go away to Europe and you come back from New York, you check with Zippy. You come into New York, you check with Zippy. If you don't have his phone number, you just don't know anything, evidently, because Zippy seems to be the thing that tells you where to go or what to do for the beautiful people. Well, in 1975, he leaped to high society, and Truman Capote wrote about him. He was furious, and he told about the naughty goings-on and the character of Zipkin and his contacts and relationship with the Duchess of Windsor, among other people. He went to Princeton University. He never graduated. He moved on to Manhattan, and he flew to Los Angeles often. He was friends with George Cukor and Louis Mayer. It's funny, Louis Mayer had a secretary, Ida Koverman. I've mentioned her on programs different times. She was the one who used to get me my autographed pictures of the movie stars, and Ida happened to be the secretary for President Herbert Hoover. And it was the direct pipeline of fascist America, Herbert Hoover, to Louis B. Mayer and Ida Koverman. And it was a nest of people also that during the Hollywood blacklisting or the control of what screenwriters were put on or who got parts. Ida Koverman was a big wig at MGM, and Zipkin was flying in often. His contacts were with Claudette Colbert. That's the actress where Ronald Reagan just visited her in the Barbados. That was his $1 million Easter vacation. And again, Somerset Maugham. This article describes Nancy Reagan, going with him. He takes her to the theater when Ronnie can't go. She's gone out with him a lot. There was a book signing party for Henry Kissinger that the Rockefellers gave, not Nancy, Happy Rockefeller, who shouldn't be so happy, but she gave a book signing party for Henry Kissinger, and Zipkin is there. He mingles with the Buckleys and the very questionable, the espionage element, the royalty, the espionage element, the seedy side, supposed to be the social side of the New York international chic. He takes her to get her clothes and to build blasts and choose the suits and the fashions. I don't know where he gets his taste from, but he gets it. He bought a collection of Somerset Maugham's writings in a book, and he gave it to the University of Texas. His route is Spain, California, Palm Beach, the Riviera, and his favorite conversation piece are his velvet evening slippers embroidered with a hammer and sickle. I just mention it, and then at the end they say he has no known love life. He's very discreet. Well, the news media is very discreet about him. And is this Nancy Reagan, Nancy Davis's contacts? What contacts, I am asking you, and because none of us really know, but it's very weird, what contacts? The Davis family pushed Nancy from Smith College out to Hollywood, and at a time when Ronnie was to dump that first wife and take Nancy, she took total control of Ronnie from that moment on in his political career. She's the dragon lady of this administration, and she has carried him to where he is, and she sits there. But is Zippy behind her? and he escorts her, and then in turn, where his contacts go, continental, intercontinental, wherever they go, what is the relationship of this particular walker? He has to be more than a walker, Mr. Zipkin. And also I mentioned the Bloomingdale story, as I say, last week, the palimony suit, same attorney for this case is the one for Mrs. Kasugi. And of course, he loves these palimony suits, that Marvin Mitchelson. Interesting circle, and he says this will be an easier one to win because Alfred Bloomingdale signed the papers for this $18,000 a month that she was supposed to get. But one thing I forgot to mention on the air last week when I was talking about that scandal again, coming close to the Reagans, is that Mr. Bloomingdale, besides being the son of the founder of Bloomingdale Department Store, he founded the American Express card and was head of that. But he was the man behind Frank Sinatra's early career. Frank Sinatra, again, has very close links to Princess Grace and Monte Carlo. And on the main line in Philadelphia, out of main line, working for the CIA, is Samuel Cummings. His headquarters are in London. He's the international arms merchant. I've done many programs on him. He's the largest weapons dealer in the world. He supplied Wilson and Churchill and Corcola with weapons. He sends them to every and any country. He has stockpiles in London, outside of London, safe houses, assassination teams, places in Virginia. Samuel Cummings has a sister who was just appointed to a mini cabinet position by Ronald Reagan at a huge salary. And that sister is married to Senator John Tower of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. The Cummings come out of Philadelphia. George DeMohrenschildt, who worked for Lockheed and various intelligence operations, Lee Harvey Oswald, not worked for him, but had direct contacts through family with agents of Lockheed, and his daughter marrying the son of vice president of Lockheed, George DeMohrenschildt, came from Germany and from the Defense Department and into this country, into Pennsylvania, and married a woman, Dee Sharples, who lived on the Philadelphia main line. Ruth Payne, who housed Lee and Marina Oswald, lived in Philadelphia. Frank Sturgis, involved in Watergate with Lee Harvey Oswald, and disinformation was from Philadelphia. I did 1 hour on the Philadelphia connections to the assassination of John Kennedy. But we have Roberto Calvi over there dying in London, Edwin Wilson's headquarters, and Wilson comes home, and the one of the chairmen of Lockheed through the years that I'm talking about now, this fellow that's Gross that was murdered was the chairman through all of these years, and that's very important. Now, I also mentioned Nancy's gems last week briefly, but there was an article, this is June the 15th in the Washington Post, Associated Press. Nancy's still got her borrowed gems. New York, First Lady Nancy Reagan has failed to return diamonds worth more than $100,000 that she borrowed 16 months ago from to wear at the inaugural party from the jeweler Harry Winston in New York. Now, they didn't say if those jewels are worth $1 million. They said they're worth more than $100,000. I once read that there was a value of $1 million or $1.5 million. I'll have to find the article. But another writer will say the gems are worth more than. You can have a house worth more than $100,000. It could be worth $6 million. But the Winston Company doesn't know whether to list it. They didn't know whether to have it for tax purposes as a gift or a loan. And as of this June, they said that she still had the diamond necklace. She took diamond earrings over for the wedding of Prince Charles, and she took diamonds to Europe. What does Nancy have? And also I mentioned, and you might not have heard it or forgot it, that the Fifth Avenue jeweler, Harry Winston, is represented by Dillon Reed, the brokers, the Wall Street brokers that were sold to Bechtel Corporation last year in March. So that the new Secretary of State, George Shultz, was president of Bechtel at the time that they purchased the Dillon Reed Corporation that carried the Harry Winston diamond people that gave or loaned Nancy Reagan a hunk of stones. And I don't think it was $100,000. They should have the precise amount of the value. More than isn't enough. But Nancy Davis is getting her stones and being paid off for probably what is a boring marriage. It may be interesting, but it must be very fearful because of so many things that are going on around them all the time, and not just the shooting of John Hinckley trying to shoot the president. Now, there's a social column in the Los Angeles Times. This broadcast sort of sounds like Luella Parson or Hedda Hopper, but this is about the way it goes, the Society of Pennsylvania, and with the murder of the Gross family. I want to repeat that. It is an important thing that those two people were murdered. Now, because of their links, Lockheed Corporation, at the time, the Thane Cesar worked there. He was to shoot Robert Kennedy from the back of the head. The Lockheed Corporation with George DeMohrenschildt, with Mr. Khashoggi, with the Saudi Arabians, with William Holden. It's all there. And finally, or just before we close, there was a society column. Jody Jacobs in the Los Angeles Times. There's a great big anniversary cake of Frank and Barbara Sinatra. It's their 6th anniversary. They made it at Chasen's, and there's a plate on top of the cake. It's almost as wide as the cake, with a picture of Frank and his wife, Barbara. And there's a little party that took place. This is July the 13th. Well, all this activity of their various contacts and so forth, or being touched, such as that primary witness of Raymond Donovan, who was in the trunk of the car in New York. And I keep repeating these. There were so many bodies strewn around between June and July, and just topping it off with this particular one in Philadelphia mainline this week. Jody Jacobs wrote, Frank Sinatra crooned true love to Barbara. The cake was the gift of Marvin Davis, the studio chief and oil man from 20th Century Fox. Now, Marvin Davis is the fellow I told you who bought 20th Century, which included our Pebble Beach territory, and that put Gerald Ford and Henry Kissinger up here at the Pebble Beach on the board of directors of Marvin Davis's corporation. The party was staged at Chasen's restaurant. Their original wedding was at the home of Waldron Lee Annenberg. She was the former ambassador in London and had a protocol for a while. Present at the party were Robert Wagner and Jill St. John. That's the woman he's going to marry very shortly. Jill was a cover for Henry Kissinger, dating him when they wanted to give him the sexy image, when there were rumors that a lot more was going on in Washington, D.C. with Henry Kissinger than being a ladies' man. And Jill St. John came to the rescue at that time. At the party was Mrs. Sidney Korshak and her husband, the attorney David Korshak. Now, Korshak, according to the Society column, he stayed in the background. He looked positively ecclesiastical in back, and he wasn't very visible at the party. Well, Korshak was the attorney for Gulf and Western, and at the time that Gulf and Western was being investigated, and I might have mentioned this to you before, he was the attorney from Cicero, Illinois, with Al Capone and the Capone gang, and that's the hometown of Paul Marcinkus, who's now under investigation with the Vatican funds and the Roberto Calvi murder and with the missing billions out of Italy. At the party was Frank Sinatra and the Marvin Davises and the Korshaks, and the whole gang was there. Nancy Reagan was not there, and Mrs. Bloomingdale was there. He was home sick, probably worrying about the story that broken about his friend Vicky Morgan. I'm sure that he would be staying home and not feeling very happy to socialize. Well, that was the social column from the Chasen's party for the Sinatras. Now, Sinatra, of course, and Grace Kelly and that main line in Philadelphia, and Samuel Cummings, his offices in Monte Carlo, are very thick. There is a connection there between Frank Sinatra and the Nancy Ronald Reagan gang, the Philadelphia connections, the Lockheed connections, the CIA, the Vatican. They're all interwoven, and they're very close. And when there's one murder is so important as Roberto Calvi in London, you have to take notice, and I have to spend time to go into the murder of the Lockheed family in Philadelphia mainland, because those things don't just happen. Something very serious preceded that murder, and the one before it triggers off, whether it's Reverend Moon going to jail, whether it's Michael Sindona in jail, whether it's Frank Nugent talking, whether it's Calvi who picked up the papers in Switzerland, and so that somebody could take them from him. See, he could cling them out of the vault and take them to London and maybe blackmail the Queen. The Queen had to meet with somebody and talk at least 10 minutes and offer some scotch, and the police or the palace guards didn't come for another 10 minutes when she rang, And then they took her to a hospital a day and a half later for whatever reason. And she's, 58 years old and had her wisdom tooth taken care of 2 days after that incident. You haven't seen a picture of her with her husband, or in righteous anger about the fellow being there. We haven't seen a thing about the Queen of England since that incident. And because of Calvi's links to the royal family in England, I think there is a lot to think about. Also, since my program last week, I was on the air Monday, and then Tuesday where there was the article that Mr. Begelman of MGM was out. David Begelman resigned from Columbia Pictures after a forgery and embezzlement scandal 5 years ago. He went on to MGM, United Artists, and with a moment's notice, he was out. The timing of his departure coincides with the circulation throughout Hollywood of that book, Indecent Exposure, that I talked about on the air. MGM Chairman Frank Rothman, who represented Begelman at the time of the Columbia problems, who then went on to become head of MGM, is finding another chairman of MGM. Now, one of the people who's worked with MGM, been on the board and had the controlling stock for a while, was the Bronfmans, a member of the Bronfman family, and the Seagram whiskey people, and 2,000 other wineries and corporations. And it was under the Bronfman group that Permindex was formed in Montreal, Canada, out of Italy. Alessio Gelli and Roberto Calvi and Michael Sindona and the assassination teams that linked with Clay Shaw in New Orleans, where Lee Harvey Oswald was, with the Nazi connections, the far-right connections, the DeMohrenschildt connections, and not the Cuban links at all. This transition here of Bronfman, he still has a lot of stock at MGM. They were making the movie, their last big movie or big investment was the Natalie Wood movie. When she died right after William Holden died, and Holden had tentacles to the international bankers, to various countries where there is a lot of activity going on at the present time. See, to analyze some of the currents that are taking place now, the system, our system in this country or any other country, can't survive the flow of capital that is leaving to go out to other countries to be put into plans, say, for military coups or dictatorships. We have banks that are collapsing, such as the one in Oklahoma that's linked to the Continental in Chicago. That goes to David Kennedy and Michael Sindona and espionage activities there. The missing money from Wells Fargo that was supposed to be $200 or $300 million, that was reduced down to $23 million. Was it $300 million, and what will happen to Wells Fargo? They're the total banker for the entire Bechtel Corporation. Hundreds of millions and billions of dollars go entirely to the Wells Fargo. Now, whenever these huge banks are being investigated, whether it's $2 billion that leaves Italy, whether it's $26 billion that leaves another bank in Italy, whether it's the bank in Milan or in Rome, whether it's $300 million or $200 million or 23 in California, whether it's $45 million in the Franklin Bank that Michael Sindona helped collapse in New York City, and I could go on. Many people have called me and they're interested in this flow of money. But every investigator who goes into these banks is going to tap to the same cast of characters. So you will hear my referring to their names over and over again, and it will be necessary that primary people will be killed so that the flow of information is cut off. They can say to Calvi, here's your Brazilian passport, here's your Brazilian name, here's your 18,000, just go to Switzerland and take the papers out that link the Queen of England to these scandals to the Mother Lodge, okay? He takes them out and he goes to London and he's killed and the papers aren't there. It's similar, say, Karen Silkwood wants to tell the New York Times about the spill of uranium and what's going on with that Kerr-McGee and the situation where she was working. So she has a car accident. She has the papers with her. The papers are removed and never seen again. Then they go back to her apartment, and the refrigerator is filled with radiation anyway. So it didn't really matter. She would have died, but they made sure that she thought she'd have her moment to get her papers to somebody. I think it's important. A lot of people say to me, and maybe I don't think this is an excuse, but they say, why don't you write a book? Why don't you put this into a book? the point is that you can summarize all this book and get a tight manuscript and take that book on your way to the publisher. And that's the day you'll be off. When you get it all together so it's understandable, when you put the pieces down there, when you have the footnotes, when the publisher says, that's it, we've got the story, you wouldn't survive that story. I think it's more important to take the thread of news that happens, say, every day or every week and analyze it with you. And if you like the broadcast, you listen. And if you like them a lot, you can tape them every week. You can buy expensive tapes at Thrifty or Kmart, sometimes $3 for $1, and play them over and over. And you can write to me and send a self-addressed stamped envelope, and I'll send you the articles and the sources of information that are coming out, that I'm using on the broadcast. Now, there's one thing I want to say before the program is over. This has to do with contributing to the station. People from out of town, naturally, you don't send money to the station because you have stations to support yourself. Up in the Bay Area, in the San Jose area, donate to those stations that play these tapes and show them you appreciate by giving them the money. But in this area, there are many, many people who always call me and ask me questions about things in the news, and particularly when there's murders or scandalous stories coming. And I'm always available. And I think I'll change the technique now. If you participate, if you join Kazoo, if you send $15 to KAZU as a member of Kazoo and show that you appreciate it, then I will answer your questions. And you can call me, or I do interviews with people. A young person called me today who just graduated from UC Santa Cruz. He wanted to ask me a question about something, and I've done interviews, and he wanted to do an article a while back. I helped him with one. He wanted another one. I said, where were you yesterday when we raised money for the station and met? Well, if people can't get there and it wasn't convenient and they missed that opportunity, I'm on the air. It's free for you, 1 hour a week, okay? And Kazoo gives you that time. But if you want more at my home, if you send a membership, I'll answer your questions anytime you want, or be interviewed with you, write articles with you. You can use my research. But if you don't want to become a member of the station and help support them, it'll cost you $15 to ask me a question, okay? So if you call my house and you ask me a question, pay in advance. I won't answer you and take a pledge. They take pledges. I don't take pledges. Mail them a check. And when they get the check, it'll be just one day, or leave it off. They'll call me, and then I'll take your question. And then once you're a member, I'll answer your question all year. So for $15, you get a year of information, which you don't get on the air. You can ask me at home. Is that fair enough? And that way I'll save time because I won't have to answer the phone all day at home, and they'll get the money. So if you don't give the money, I'll have the time. And that's the way it's going to work, and I think that's fair. So we'll wind up now. We have 1 minute. Watch these people that are big off. The Lockheed case was terribly important, following on top of the Calvi case and right behind Nancy Davis's brother, because Nancy Davis was Nancy Davis before she was Mrs. Reagan. And as soon as she latched on to Reagan, Mr. Zippy, Baby Zip, latched on to her. And these walkers are very important. They are the puppeteers that control the strings, and the rewards are the diamonds around the necks and ears. And there's a logical connection between it all. So you just watch the parade, okay? This is Mae Brussell on Kazoo. I'll be back with you next week. Take care, and we'll be back next Monday.
KAZU, Pacific Grove.